just the usual announcements, sort of repeating them in a way, but there's still confusion caused by me when I switched from, this is about the next course, Division 2. And most of you know it was called a seminar and it was called 290, and then the seminar was canceled because there were too many people for a seminar, and it was turned into a course which is 189, and anybody who has taken this course and passed it is eligible to take it. It requires you take this first. I mean, in case there's anybody listening on the podcast or something, you can't take 189 without having passed 185, but otherwise you can. It's probably a little harder, it's maybe toward the end anyway, when you get to temporality, than anything we've read. If it looks really hard, you can always switch to pass, not pass, if you want to, or just audit it if you want to just understand how the story ends, and you don't want to slug through another heavy dose of Heidegger. But the main thing is just to let you know that you can now sign up for Philosophy 189. Has anybody actually succeeded in signing up for 189? There was a problem where it insisted on discussion sections, and we didn't give it discussion sections. Has anybody tried to do 189 and not been able to sign up? This is very mysterious. Is anybody going to take 189? I see. Well, you're waiting for your time to sign up comes around. Is that what's happening? How does it work? Okay. Well, I guess when the time comes for you to sign up, it'll be possible to sign up. David says it's all fixed, so go ahead and sign up when you want to. We've got a room. Dave is going to be the TA. Everything is in order. Oh, and one other important thing. I made a note to myself, but I forgot to bring the note, but I remembered what the point of the note was, that I just should say that it's not going to be podcast. That might influence some people who wanted to take it but not come to not take it, and it might influence some people who thought they could listen on podcasts well, what do I mean? Anyway, I just mean that it's something you should maybe want to take into account. I think that's it. Oh, and that's it for the announcements. Now, what I hope to do is finish talking about discourse today and begin talking about falling. And then that leaves us one lecture behind still. But I hope to finish falling on Tuesday. So read the falling part. And remember, there's this part to skip, which I will just put back on the board. So for next week, well, you've already supposedly read for this time already up to where we are. So I want you to continue to go, because we're going to get to this. Well, no, I know. I hope to get to starting this Thursday. That's what I'm trying to say. So next Thursday, we're going to get 224 to 241, and we're going to skip the anxiety part, which is 228 to 235, and 241 to 244. Okay, can you see that? I'm sort of in the way of it. Now, let's go back to where we were. We're finishing talk, the discourse part. And I keep trying to tell myself and tell you, because I really find it such a crazy thing to get a grip on, just this terminology. Why is he calling it talk? And when he is calling it talk, then there's several different kinds of something or other that falls under talk. Some of it involves words, and sometimes it doesn't, and so forth. So let me try to sort it out again. I think there is something, and this may not be right, but I got to keep trying, and then you can come to office hours and tell me why it's wrong, and then we'll all learn something. But Heidegger has a kind of methodological idea, which is not very good, that he wants to call the condition of the possibility of something primordial something. you'll see the main ones when you get to truth. He's got a notion of primordial truth that makes ordinary correspondence truth possible. He's got, when you get to time, he's got a notion of temporality that's supposed to make ordinary time possible. And when he does talk about it under temporality, he says you can name the more powerful thing by what it makes possible. And that's in Latin, he says that. That must be somewhere, some philosopher has said it. So I think maybe we can say that he's got a notion of primordial talk, and that's not words and people speaking. That's, remember we got there last time, that's the fact that the referential totality is articulated, that has joints, and therefore, because of that primordial structure of articulated, that primordial articulated structure, that makes possible talking when words, because you can name the joints. So maybe that's what he's up to. We know that ordinary talk is founded on what we might want to call primordial talk on 204. And maybe that would help just sort out these two. There's no doubt that he's got a kind of two different things here. So he says on 204, the second paragraph, as an existential state in which Dasein is disclosed, discourse is constitutive of Dasein's existence. I guess I've got to read that Dasein is disclosed as a discloser of the referential totality of significance and all these joints. It doesn't fit the text too well, but that seems to be what I'm going to believe that's what he thinks. Discourse is constitutive for Dasein's existence. But that doesn't mean talking yet, because he says hearing and keeping silent are possibilities belonging to discursive speech. That's, I think, talking, words. In these phenomena, the constitutive functions of discourse for the existentiality of existence becomes entirely plain for the first time. Well, that seems to me something like the claim that what this articulation of the joints becomes changed into speaking articulation, and speaking articulation makes Dasein's job as an articulator, both of the referential totality with its joints, its nodes or whatever, and of the being that can name them. That's how I'm going to think about it anyway. I want to say primordial ontological talk carves up the world into affordances or whatever, joints, whatever, like doors and windows and lecterns, as solicitations to act in to do this or to do that. And we can then name them and talk about them. So another way, now to just talk about the phenomena, another way to put it, which I can understand better, because that's always better to have a phenomenon, as we develop skills, we can disclose and all kinds of distinctions, which we don't have at first. Remember this, and these distinctions that we get as we acquire skills show up in the world as things looking different. The usual example is the Merleau-Ponty example. A city looks more and more full of distinctions, like turn right for the bakery and turn left for the laundry and so forth, as you get to know it. A better example here would be, imagine that a surgeon has a skill for cutting in many, many different ways, many more than we've got names for, or that anybody's got names for. But as he acquires more and more skill, he articulates the domain of cuttable bodies into more and more distinctions. And they're not ineffable. Heidegger doesn't think that there's anything of these distinctions and nodes that you can't name. So if the surgeon wants to teach how to make a new kind of operation, he can name the way he cuts. And then he articulates the discriminations, which is my new word here for articulations. It's the same thing. He articulates the discriminations that he can make of various kinds of cutting. There is something, just to get clear where I stand, and I'm sure Heidegger too, there is something that it can't be put into words, which is, in a certain way, ineffable. And that's the skill itself. That you can't program the skill the surgeon exercises when he looks at the tissue and can see that this is cuttable that way and this should be cut that way and so forth. He sees all these distinctions that his experience has given him. His experience has given him skills. His skills show up in the world as distinct-looking different tissue in the body, and those different distinct tissues in the body show up. I mean, that's a funny story. I tell you a story to make this clear. My brother and I, two funny stories. Okay, both from our days when we worked for the Air Force as doing the phenomenology of skills. There were two amazing moments. One was there was, and it was sort of like Dr. Strangelove or something. There was a famous, I guess, the lieutenant colonel or some rather high character who had been the best tank commander in Vietnam and had won all the medals and so forth. And he was getting old, and he was convinced that if they got an expert system that could do what he did, then they could install it in the tanks, and after he died, he would still be fighting all the battles and winning all the battles because his expertise, his skill would have been captured in this expert system and be in the tank. And my brother and I were trying to tell him, no, I'm afraid we're sorry, you can't do that. And he said, oh, it's easy, let me explain. He lived up on a sort of mountain with walls around. And he said, come out here, I'll show you. When you're on a hill like that, that's the kind of hill you should put the tank on. And we looked, and it was completely flat as far as we could see. There wasn't any hill at all. But I'm sure if we'd had enough experience of years of time, he obviously could discriminate levels that we couldn't even see. And we told him, we're sorry, we can't capture that in an expert system. And he was very unhappy about that. And that was the end. That was all we had to do with him. Which is just as well, because he was really sort of like, what's the name of the lieutenant in Apocalypse Now? Kilgore, is that his name? Who loves the smell of napalm in the morning? I think that's this guy. Yes. When we were told to talk to him, we said, and don't talk politics with him. His politics is to the right of Attila the Hun. So we got out of there as quickly as we could. But I remember now, as I was telling you this, another one. Maybe I told you this already about where the fact that you can't capture the skills in words was dramatically shown to my brother. I wasn't there on this occasion. Another tank thing. We were involved with the tanks, and there was a what do you call it? A mock battle, in which my brother was in one of the tanks, and the tank leader got the tank up on a hill that everybody could actually see, and he had a beautiful view of the whole battlefield, and he could shoot at any tank he wanted of the enemy, and bong, of course, his tank was shot out from under him. And there was an old sergeant who'd had lots of experience, and the lieutenant turned to him and said, what happened? And he said, well, you put the tank where you could see everything, but of course everybody could see you. And he said, well, what should I have done? How can I recognize where I should put it? You haven't heard this story? And then the sergeant said, I can't give you no fucking formula. You'll know when you see one. And that's the part of it that can't be put into words. And okay, now back to where we were. So where are we? Let's see. Oh, okay, yeah, that's it. And so now, why call the capacity to see these distinctions talk? Well, as I say, you could only call it talk since it hasn't got words by thinking of it as primordial talk. Is what makes talk possible is that there are these discriminations that people are able to make. And that takes you back to page 56, which is another clue of a different sort, but important too. The second paragraph on 56. When fully concrete, discoursing, letting something be seen, and that's the more basic kind. That's just pointing things out at their joints. I guess there are three things. Oh dear, I thought I only had two. There's the referential totality is articulated. It has joints. You can articulate it by pointing out the joints. We don't have to use words. You can just watch what the surgeon does, or you can. Now I remember another story. This is a very short one. There's a famous Danish auto mechanic, apparently. I was working for the Danish skill people at that point, who apparently doesn't say any word ever to his assistants. And they watch him, they're apprentices, and they watch him work on cars, and after they've spent enough years watching him work on cars, they're the best auto mechanics too in Denmark. And I presume that's because he could point out, and what does it say, let them see the important distinctions in, say, motors and carburetors and stuff, but he doesn't have to proclaim it into words. But it can be put in the words. And Adam, I need help with the Greek. I was going to ask you before, but I just got back from a trip in time to get here. So tell me what this says.
Okay, logos is phone, which means
we talk. Says, aha. Okay. Voiced. Yeah.
And phone meta fantasias is he says utterance or something voiced that is with an appearance or something cited. So
let something be seen. Okay, that's...
The meta just means along with, though. It's very vague.
Very vague. Well, but it's his story. That logos, then, it becomes concrete. That's the part I really want in speech. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't disagree with what was happening in the Greek. And notice the concrete talk. Doesn't that remind you of how Befindlichkeit, that is disposedness, becomes concrete in moods? So there always is this more abstract capacity, which is receptivity when it's disposedness, which gets its kind of best paradigm, fullest expression as something or other. So disposedness, receptivity, gets its best, fullest sort of paradigm expression in moods. Though we talked about how there could be other things than moods. Somebody gave me good ones in office hours. Anybody remember? Didn't we have sort of emotions, but all other things too than even emotions? Anyway, you can imagine. I said love would be one of them. Love isn't a mood, but it's part of receptivity. And I'm sure there are lots of affects, maybe we should call them, which aren't moods. And so the broad category takes into account all sorts of stuff, but then it becomes concrete or manifest at its best in something. So this capacity we've got for pointing out the joints becomes concrete or manifest or works at its best when we name them. And that seems all right. I'm just trying to get these two layers sorted out. Now let's see if I want to say anything more. So I just said it again in my notes. I think I shouldn't say things over and over too often or they turn to mush. So let me skip this for a minute. So I just want to say it's at each case you ought to be able to find a primordial ontological structural capacity which makes ontic everyday something or other, is realized in or concrete in everyday something or other. And whether it's truth or discourse or what was the other one, temporality, and there are others too. Heidegger's always got these two levels. I think maybe understanding is this primordial capacity to press into possibilities. And there's only one. This I haven't ever said that I think Eugene pointed out to me. Remember, I had two notions of understanding. Primary, which was pressing into possibilities, just everyday coping, and primordial, which was understanding, taking a stand on your being. But I was convinced that's wrong now. It's all pressing into possibilities. But there's a whole spectrum of pressing into possibilities, from the most basic, going out the to go out, and to the most complicated, taking a stand by giving yourself an identity. And those would be two ways that primordial understanding, as pressing into possibilities, which is very general, becomes concrete. And I don't know which is the paradigm. That one of them, you could think of them either one as the paradigm. And the primary, Heidegger means, that's the most basic one. And the other one is the taking a stand, which is, and he calls it primordial. And I guess, if you had to think about it, the taking a stand is what gives your coping a point. And it's that kind of understanding, namely sort of who you are and what you're up to, is the paradigm most developed, most concrete, I'm just guessing, kind of understanding. And I keep trying to get that. And whenever I get this finally figured out, I give you a chart in which it's all settled. But it isn't settled in my head yet. So now primordial articulation becomes concrete in talk, which points out articulations to, now comes a new move, to other people. What's the special feature of words? Well, again, with the Danish auto mechanic, you could get along without them, but they do help a lot to make the distinctions shared. Enable people to learn to share the things that you distinguish and care about. And so speech has this special role. I don't think he thinks that it has to do this. I mean, that would be nice if he did, but I think he's right. The phenomena doesn't say that you have to use words. I guess you could get a lot. How far you could get without words is an interesting question, because animals get a long way without any words at all, and children before the age of 2 have lots of discriminations and can point out things and so forth. But certainly the way public intelligibility works is that there has to be finally a shared language. And that's what he's saying on 205, where he talks about communication in the middle of the page. The second line in the middle paragraph, page 162 in the German. Communication in which one makes assertions, giving information for examples. A special case of the communication which is grasped in principle existentially. So it's part of the existential structure of articulation or discourse that it works for communication. In this more general kind of communication, the articulation of being with one another understandingly is constituted. That is, you can't get very far, he thinks, and I'm sure it's right, so socially having a shared understanding and a shared world if you weren't able to talk. Through it, that is, talk, a co-state of mind, that is, co-disposedness, gets shared, and so does the understanding of being with. And it's important that you can get a shared understanding beyond just that you understand something like the flower story from Sesame Street, where only without the flowers in the brain, I can point out a flower and you can see the flower. That's the first level. But it's important also that we're able to share that it's shared. Charles Taylor has written about this. You have to think about, say, a party in which there's a joyful mood. And you're feeling joyful, and I'm feeling joyful, and everybody in the party is feeling joyful. But it's another whole level when everybody in the party realizes that everybody in the party shares that mood of being joyful. And that's really, I think, where you've got to bring in language, is that there's a world in which there are symbols, which could be works of art, could be poems, could be speeches like the Gettysburg Address, where people all share what it is that they all share, what their community believes, and so forth. And I think that's what he's talking about at the end of that paragraph. Communication is never anything like conveying an experience from one interior to another. That's the second Sesame Street version. That's the wrong version. Dasein with is essentially manifest in a co-state of mind, a co-understanding, and discourse being with becomes explicitly shared. That's the highest thing you can do with it. That is to say, it is already shared. You see, everybody's in the party is already joyful, but it is unshared as something that has not been taken hold of and appropriated. That is, it can be just in fact shared, or thanks to language, you can all recognize and agree that you share it. Somebody who's a big baseball fan, I'm not, so I can't tell you the phenomenon firsthand, but he says there's this special thrill when somebody does something really terrific and everybody stands up, and it's part of the thrill that everybody knows that everybody else is being thrilled in exactly the same way at the same time. That's the shared that it's shared. And there, you don't do it with language, but the general job of language is to help people communicate that what's going on is shared. That's what I think about that. And now it becomes, all that is sort of okay, but not very, I don't know. I think it's, if you spell it out like Taylor does about the importance of sharing, that it's shared and how it works, I think there's probably deep things in here, but it doesn't connect up much with anything else, and it isn't anything really surprising or important about language in the end, I'm afraid, that he's saying. Now, I wouldn't dare say that about Heidegger if it wasn't that Heidegger himself says it about Heidegger. There's something sort of unsatisfactory about the language thing, and I'd probably have been showing it if by my sort of struggle to talk about it. But he says it explicitly on 206, that he hasn't done the job of really understanding the being of language. He says at the end of the first full paragraph, down a ways on page 163. On 206, he says, we would, where will I start? Even if one were to put the various fragmentary definitions of language together, nothing would be achieved in the way of a full, adequate definition of language. We would still have to do what is decisive here, to work out in advance the ontologico-existential whole of the structure of discourse on the basis of the analytic of Dasein. See, that's what you'd think he was sort of doing, but he isn't doing it very clearly or very well, and he knows he isn't. He doesn't even, and this is interesting, understand the being of language, he says. That means that in all the stuff I've been talking about, articulating, which is important, all right, for which language is certainly important, all right, he asks himself whether language is an instrument ready, is some kind of instrument ready to hand for pointing out shared things, or is language a present-at-hand entity, a bunch of words and grammatical rules for putting them together, or does language have some third kind of being, which is more like the being of Dasein? He says this he asks this on 209, but he doesn't answer it. So the bottom of 209, the last paragraph, on 166 in the German. In the last resort, philosophical research must resolve to ask what kind of being goes with language in general. Is it a kind of equipment ready to hand, or has it got Dasein's kind of being, or neither of these? And the interesting thing is that in the end, it looks in Being and Time mostly the way I've explained it, and I think I was following it. It looks like an instrument for articulating the joints and pointing out the joints and pointing out the shared, pointing out that we share in seeing things. And yet, when Heidegger, and that's probably what the view in here is, but Heidegger knows that he's not satisfied with that, there's lots about language he hasn't captured right. Yeah.
But even though he doesn't develop it, it does need, in a sense, to be developed. I mean, he says at one point, he presupposed it in account of everything so far, and he sort of suppressed it even.
That's right. But he doesn't do it. He doesn't develop it.
But he would need to, because if being in the world is being within a referential
No. Yes and no, but I mean, that's just a...
In the primordial sense, where it's a question of...
But that's just a kind of pun. Wait a minute. I mean, the referential whole isn't really reference. I mean, it's the way the lectern refers to the table is not a linguistic kind of reference, and that's already the referential totalities.
But I mean, discourse or Rede, it's not really language either, right? So there's something that...
Okay, but reference really is, though. I mean, the referential whole, isn't about linguistic reference, and he doesn't have any other kind of reference. I mean, I'm not. Why should he need? How does the kind of referring of the referential whole relate to language? That's what I don't understand. Or you're saying he should tell us that, but it's so sublinguistic the way tables relate to.
But he has to give an account of how something could be significant or signified.
Yeah. Okay, he does,
in
but.
order to account for familiarity.
I see. Well, but he doesn't. I agree with you. But the funny thing about that is he never does, and I think it's impossible. I mean, it's rock bottom. What you're saying is, how is he going to tell us? What does he have to tell us about the phenomenon of way the lectern refers to the table and the table refers to the floor and so forth? What more can he say? Well, he could say a little. It's all familiar. And you have to have familiarity. They don't just sit around referring. It's only when you understand how they all function with each other that you understand the referential totality. That's fine. But what more can he say? If you know, Curtis, what more he can say, I'd love to hear you.
I don't want to hear this, but on page 209 and 210, he says he doesn't want to deal with language. He postpones that discussion. He doesn't want to talk about the ontological status of language.
Because he doesn't know what to say.
Exactly. He wants to tell us what is the basis of language. You kind of want to stop there.
That's right. He knows dimly. I mean, this is not so mysterious. I can finish he knows dimly that there's something more and something important about language which he doesn't know what to say yet. And now I can tell you, and that's why I'm telling you this, that he kept a copy of Being in Time in his ski hut in the Black Forest where he went to write his stuff, and there are marginal notes, a lot of them, in it. Did I ever mention that? If I didn't, I think I may have. I think I remember myself saying in the Jones-Stanbaugh translation, the marginal notes are translated, and for that very reason, I got a copy of the Jones-Stanbaugh translation and put it in Howison Library in case you want to look at whatever marginal notes he might have written about whatever paragraphs you might want to write about. But there's and he seldom, I only know 2 places where he says in the marginal notes he was wrong. And one of them is about language. And so I'm going to read you what he says at the top of 121. He's talking about this crucial story about articulation that I already talked about, and I read this passage last time, I think, the top of 121. In the German, it's the very bottom of 87. And he says, remember the second paragraph, or the first full paragraph, but in significance itself with which Dasein is always familiar, there lurks an ontological condition which makes it possible for Dasein, as something which understands and interprets, to disclose such things as signification. Upon these, in turn, is founded the being of words and of language. That's the whole story I've been telling you, because that's the story he tells in here. But he writes in the margin, not true. Language is not tiered, layered. Rather, language is the primordial essence of the truth of the there. Now, that's pretty mysterious. But what he wants to say is language really discloses the clearing. That thanks to language, the world shows up, I think, as having a certain style. Maybe, and yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. I don't remember how Jones-Stanbaugh translates it, but I translate it language. He certainly says not true. Then he says language is not layered or tiered. You get the picture. The tiered layer, the tiered story, and the layer story is, well, there are these referential totality at the bottom, and it has nodes, and on top of those nodes you add words. That's the wrong thing. He says it's not tiered. It is the primordial essence of the truth of the there. Now, that's pretty, weird talk.
Is that later Heidegger?
Yes, that's later Heidegger.
I want to talk about his being.
Exactly. That's later Heidegger going back and writing in the margin. But this is why he sensed he hadn't got it right in Being in Time, because there's a more basic function of language, which is really later he's going to say the poetic function, where language can name new distinctions and make people notice them and share them, and bring them, so to speak, into the clearing, into disclosive space. And he thinks that's the main function of language. It's language when it's already dead, when it's just got normal words like nails and doors referring to nails and doors. It's when something new, my example, which is a bit dated now, but when I was teaching here in the 70s, the people in Marin were known for having their hot tubs and their marijuana and their a certain Marin lifestyle. I remember once visitors from Marin calling up the person at their house to start warming up their hot tub because they were on the way home, and so forth. But what I want to say about that is somebody called that laid back, and that became obviously a way of talking about that lifestyle, and that helped presumably the people in Marin understand what they were doing and get more equipment for doing it. And all of this is the poetic use of language. There wasn't a node called laid back, which some poet just dumped a word on. It shows up that way thanks to having a new name for it. Heidegger's got. We go to the fountain through the word fountain. I don't know what he has in mind with that. My example, another example I made up, besides the Marin one, is that instead of the fountain, if he said to me, we go through to the woods, through the word woods, I'd sort of say, yeah, I see that, because we've got all these different words, and we approach it differently as a wilderness, as a grove, as a copse, as a forest, as a woods. They're just a bunch of trees. But depending on what discriminations poets writing about them have given, you'll see them differently, and they're not again just nodes on the referential whole in which words are plopped there. They're constantly, poets are making new distinctions. I saw another hand. No? Okay, I think I'm done with that. That's as far as we'll. That isn't even going to be next semester, because he doesn't get any clearer about the way language functions until way later. And in the later Heidegger, he writes a lot about language and a lot about poetry. There's some place in here he writes a sentence about poetry, which is sort of pathetic. I don't think I can open to it. Maybe you can remember. I think it's in the Disposiveness chapter, where he tells you that poets write about their feelings. And that's just not very Heideggerian, and it's a pretty simple-minded view of poetry. That goes with his not understanding this other thing about language, which he knows he's missing, but doesn't know what it is. Okay, that's time to finish language. I was supposed to finish it about a week ago. We're going on to fallenness. And falling is... no, I don't want to do falling yet. That's... Wait a minute, I don't think I do. Just a second. No, falling for... I may get there yet, but we've got to do things in the order they are here. And the order back to where we are. Where are we? We're on to... Yeah, here we are on 210. The next thing after the talk about language and discourse and logos and all that we've been doing is to talk about a whole section on falling. And I'm going to start with it next time, because this little introductory piece doesn't mean anything by itself on 210. That falling is a big... But I will tell you this much. How many have been reading the falling part already? It's hard because, but I said this once, but I have to keep saying it, I think falling has at least these two different meanings, which is meaning being absorbed in the world and in coping, and then something bad that you do with that, where you cover up what's going on. And I'll talk about that next time. But before we get there, we've got these sort of existentialist kind of outbursts on where he talks about idle talk, and he talks about curiosity, and he talks about ambiguity. That's one I want to talk about them now. Those sections would be interesting for paper topics only because they've got in them the same kind of confusion that you get in that's part of the one. There's something positive about the way discourse works, which is not idle talk, but which means the German is Gerede means gossip or chatter, and the latest word for it. I don't know if you followed this big success of the book by a professor at Princeton named Harry Frankfurt on bullshit. Do you know that? You must have heard about it. It was a big hit. It's strange that a philosophy book. Well, I think that what Harry Frankfurt calls bullshit is exactly what Heidegger calls idle talk. For instance, he says a kind of thing that Harry Frankfurt says, that the person engaged in this isn't trying to lie or deceive you, he says on 213. It's that bullshit is not false statements. It's some way of talking that isn't functioning to disclose anything. It's functioning more to cover up everything. I think it'd be an interesting paper topic, and if you're interested and your TA doesn't like it, I'll consider it. I would like to compare Harry Frankfurt on bullshit to Heidegger on idle talk. I think it would be very illuminating. I don't know. Do you think they're the same? I think they're probably the same. But I mean, you'd learn a lot because Frankfurt's very interesting and smart and a real phenomenologist, though he is considered an analytic philosopher. He's going to describe the phenomena, and Heidegger's going to do it here. And one more reference, because it's a whole interesting subject. Harry Frankfurt's probably never read Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard's got a category in his... Kierkegaard wrote something called The Present Age, in which he talked about all the things that's wrong with contemporary 1850 Denmark, which is still wrong with us. And he has a category he calls talkativeness. I don't know what the Danish is, but I think Heidegger gets this thing about idle talk from Kierkegaard on talkativeness. But then you get a new problem. That is, Kierkegaard's clear that he's talking about some negative, bad thing that people do. The trouble is that Heidegger's got two things mixed up in here, just like he does in the one. There's a sense in which, let me back up and make it, because I jumped something. What idle talk in Kierkegaard and in Heidegger, no, that's not the way to do it. Idle talk in Heidegger is how you use language to talk about what you don't know anything about, that you're just passing the word along. And you pretend to sort of know all sorts of stuff, and you talk about it as if you knew, and you maybe even fool yourself into thinking you know what you're talking about, but you really are you aren't relating to the phenomena. And that's negative, for sure. And that's, I think, what Kierkegaard means by talkativeness. And I don't know whether it's what Frankfurt means by bullshit, but one should find out. But there is also a sense in which it's an important positive aspect of intelligibility, that we use language outside the situations in which we definitely know what we're talking about and can actually see it and point it out. And so that passing the word along is not always a negative sort of phenomenon. If we couldn't talk about anything except what we were sort of nose to nose with in the situation, we'd be in bad shape. And I think he's got these two notions mixed up together, so that idle talk, Gerede seems to cover gossip and chatter, and it also seems to cover saying whatever you say when you haven't got the sort of full right to say it. It's either something that you haven't studied or it's something that you haven't got in front of you. I think I've used the example, but I'll use it again. If you take your car in to be fixed because it's making a sputtering kind of noise, and your car mechanic says, yes, when you pick it up, the carburetor was dirty, and you go home and your partner asks you, well, what was wrong with the car, and you say the carburetor was dirty, well, that's idle talk because you have no clue what carburetors are, I'm assuming, and you're just passing the word along. But that's a necessary thing. What if you would just refuse to answer the question because you don't have any first-hand knowledge? That would be silly. I mean, it tells something, and a lot of what we know or what we talk about, we don't fully understand. Philosophers are sort of annoying in that respect. At least I annoy my wife, and I know that other people's husbands or wives that aren't philosophers get upset if you keep asking people sort of, and how do you know that? And did you hear that? And did you hear that on the radio? But how do you know you should believe the guy on the radio? Or where did you read it? Or more questions about it. I mean, I think it's a perfectly sensible thing to want to find out find out whether the person telling you something, how much the person that's telling you something is really understands of what they're telling you. But you've got to put up with it. Yeah. Okay, I marked it. I'll go back to my notes. Now let's go back to my notes. Let's see. Well, to begin with, but this is not it yet. I'm just taking a slight detour. It's important at the top of 211, right before he introduces idle talk, he wants to say that he's talking purely ontologically. He's not making a moralizing critique of everyday Dasein and so forth. Now, that's already an interesting sort of clue, because I think that's ambivalent too. I think sometimes he is really describing some structure, and it's not anything that you should blame anybody for. Maybe the carburetor in my example is like that. But there is sometimes it looks to me like he is saying sort of that this is a bad way to use language and a bad way to be. So the problem is still around. I haven't answered your question. So let's go on. So on 211, again, I don't think this is going to settle it, but he says that it's a positive phenomenon. We have to understand what that means. The expression idle talk is not used here in a disparaging signification. Terminologically, it signifies a positive phenomenon which constitutes the kind of being of everyday Dasein's understanding and interpreting. That makes it look like it's it covers a lot of what everybody has to do all the time. They only talk about stuff that they don't really, deeply, primordially understand. But let me go on. I haven't answered Curtis. I understand that. So I have other quotes which make it look. Remember, I'm trying to argue that Heidegger sees that passing the word along, talking about what you don't really know much about, is something that is necessary if we're going to get around in the world. Let's skip down to about 10 lines below where it says 168 in the margin on 211. The understanding which has been, let's see, where are we now? Primordial. Let's begin in the middle, right above the 168. Proximally and within certain limits, Dasein is constantly delivered over to this interpretiveness which controls and distributes the possibilities of average understanding and of the average disposedness. The way things have been expressed or spoken out is such that in the totality of the context of significance into which it's been articulated, it preserves an understanding of the disclosed world and therewith equiprimordial understanding of Dasein being with and so forth. Now, that doesn't sound, bad. The understanding which has thus already been deposited in the way things have been expressed pertains just as much to any traditional discoveredness of entities which may have been reached as it does to one's current understanding of being, and to whatever possibilities and horizons for fresh interpretation and conceptual articulation may be available. Now, all that looks like a perfectly sensible, what do you think? I mean, it doesn't sound yet like a negative covering up.
It sounds like it's just communication enabled. That's the positive side.
Yes, and that's right. And it sounds like he's just sort of laying out the positive side there. And he's at the very bottom of the page. He says it makes communication possible. And I think that doesn't sound like he's saying that there's anything wrong with it. I mean, it's necessary for everyday communication and intelligibility.
It doesn't seem like it really furthers the understanding and that positive aspect, but it does further the communication.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. Now, but there is, but I want to go on a little bit more there, because I'm trying to sort out, as I talk about these three, the positive and the negative. They all have, keep in remembering the one. The one, the norms, are necessary for conforming and for intelligibility, but they also lead to being conformist and covering up by always just looking at what one sees and what one does. It can be a bad influence. So I think you're going to get the same thing always, and that's obviously some important structural fact going on here. And here, this is average intelligibility, Gerede. I mean, don't you feel a kind of tension between gossip and bullshit on the one hand, and average everyday intelligibility on the other? I mean, do they sound like the same thing? I don't think so. And yet Heidegger's just weaving them together in a way that gets you the Kierkegaardian sort of denunciation of them, but preserves also a kind of Heideggerian sense of everydayness. Okay, two hands, here and then here. Yeah.
I guess I don't understand what he thinks the negative is that well.
We haven't really talked about it yet. Go ahead.
I guess there are lots of conversations you've had like this class where you're like trying to find out what's true about things, but these like idle talk conversations, it seems like a lot of the time the point isn't to like uncover a deep truth about being or something. You just like want to talk to someone as like a social thing, like you enjoy the conversation or whatever. And so the fact that it's not like that it's covering up being in some sense seems like not much of a criticism of it.
Okay. Well, good. I think the word gossip is important here, and bullshit. There's something that he's trying to get at on the negative side, which is covering up, not just not going deep into things, but actually sort of talking about, I think, what you have no understanding of and no business talking about and no involvement and no interest. I mean, it's not like having a conversation with a friend. Gossip isn't, I don't think. And it certainly isn't like having a conversation with the grocer when you're buying the groceries. There's something really pejorative about that the notion of people just, you get the feeling of people talking without trying to communicate anything. And that's the negative kind. I'll find you passages that sound like that. But I agree with you. I mean, I'm agreeing with you that lots of the time talking is not gossiping. It's not Gerede. It's Rede. It's talk. You got it. There are two just German words. There's this German word talk, which is what you do with your friends when you have conversations, and what you do with the grocer and the car mechanic. And then there's this special word Gerede, which is this bad thing, which he keeps telling you how bad it is. I haven't read those passages yet, but I will. And he keeps telling you, of course, I'm not making any moral judgment. I'm not really saying it's bad. The whole thing is really makes me dizzy. Yeah.
Well, I think if we want to understand how idle talking is positive and negative, we have to understand how the Datsman view is positive and negative, and then we have to understand how it is that the Datsman gets this character. And I think what we want to point to is inauthenticity and authenticity here. So with respect to idle talk, I'm thinking of two examples of something called what we would say would be more original or non-idle talk, and an example of idle talk. And so like when we said like passing the word along, I remember like I think like Campbell told me one time or told the class language is long-range perception, right? And in that sense, like when I tell you like when I just like came into the room and I'm like, yeah, it's raining outside, that was like an idle talk, but it wasn't anything like the way I understood raining and outside and all of the experience I gave you with my idle talk, passing the word along throughout the world, was entirely from the Datsman, from like the one. Like I was like that phrase was governed by the Datsman. So the way I believe the Datsman is that it's that the negative aspect of the Datsman is that it, in its normative aspect, it's publicly interpreted a lot of the world already for you, and when you access it, yeah, like the world can be covered up a lot. Like you get a lot of mistakes going in.
Well, wait, but I suppose, but I'm not happy with this. But you've helped me understand something, I think. So let me try to take over what you said. Well, let me take that half first. If you take the example, you come in and you say it's raining. I think that I can sort of make a distinction. If you say that to people who are actually here and involved and have to go out in it when I finish my lecture and so forth, that's not idle talk. That's communicating something. If you come in and you say, it's raining like cats and dogs in New York, I just heard it on the news, that's talkativeness. Who cares? It's just not our concern. But there are people going around all the time telling you all the things they just read in the morning New York Times or something, even though it doesn't have anything to do with what your life is and what it was serious. That's idle talk, I think. That's just talk for the sake of, maybe there's a sort of social use for it, but it certainly isn't there because it directly connects with your concerns. You help me. Maybe that's the essence of the gossip story and the bullshit story, that you're being told things, not that are false or not, are true, but are things that it's none of your business to know and you shouldn't be caring about. Gossips go around talking about other people's private, relationships and so forth, and they're none of your business. If that's true, then it isn't going to be quite like bullshit. There's a whole interesting world here. But take your second point.
So it just goes along with, we're trying to get at what accounts for why idle talk and maybe other sorts of, activities are Heidegger believes that they have a negative side, right? And I always, I always want to go, whenever we want to talk about whether it's a negative or positive phenomenon, at least in this case, it's where is it coming from? Where is it falling from? And, a lot of times it's falling from the Dachmann, right? So my positive example is Martin Luther, when he started equating what it was to be pious with doing your task rather than going to church. He created a Protestant revolution, and that was talk that wasn't so idle, but it's positive. I want to say in the sense because it was what he was doing with his words there and with his talk was an unbounded sort of new thing, right?
That's okay. Yeah, that's too positive. Surely nobody doubts. Yeah, nobody doubts that poetic, prophetic, revolutionary kind of talk is positive. The question is this middle kind of thing. That's why your first example is interesting. What kind of thing is coming in and saying it's raining? And that's not like Martin Luther for sure, but that's not like it's raining in New York or even more raining in China. Yeah.
And why is when I repeat what Martin Luther said, how come that is going to be called idle talk?
Well, I don't know. Wait, but I think everything you say makes me think of things that you're not quite saying, but maybe you're getting there. If you repeat what Martin Luther said, just sort of because you happen to have heard or read that Martin Luther said that, and that it makes no difference in your life or the life of the person you're talking to, and it doesn't reveal anything about Protestantism or anything, it's just a report, then I think that's idle talk. That's just talkativeness. But if you say the same things the same thing Martin Luther said about works and faith and so forth, in such a way that it impinges on the people's lives and illuminates them, that's positive, all right. But now, there's so many people who want to talk. You were next, and then David was next.
Well, I guess if I try to give a clear example, I would talk about the Greek culture and Aristotle's claim that heavier objects fall faster. So then everybody now is starting to talk about this idea that heavy things fall faster. They have no business talking about it. They don't go out there and study this sort of thing. But everybody in Greek society understood that heavy objects fall faster. And this is a clear example of negative and positive aspect because, the negative aspect, they were wrong. They didn't really look into it. And the positive aspect is that it established this Greek culture and enabled this communicating body that made that one of the aspects of Greek culture. This communication side.
I'm not. I just can't. I'm not. I don't know what to say. It's just not the right kind of example. I think.
The negative thing, maybe the only thing that can be real clear about it covers something up.
Yes, well, that's right. But that's right. But that's not really covering up the way you said it. Okay, but right. But you do make me think about something. Which a second though, which I'm losing it when I try to think of it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the main point is whether what you say is false or not. If somebody came in and said heavy and light objects fall at the same speed and even gave you the formula that Newton's got for it, it would be just plain talkativeness if it came in out of nowhere. This is a Kierkegaard example. Kierkegaard has this character who's insane, and escapes from the insane asylum and goes around and tells everybody the earth is round. That nobody's asking, and it doesn't fit into the conversation, but it's an objective truth. And so it's not a question of whether what you say is true or not. It's whether what you say is relevant or not. I'm getting more and more convinced that that's the way to go. But yeah, go ahead. I mean, this is too much talking about ideas and theories and not enough about the real world. I agree. I mean, people don't gossip about whether objects fall at the same speed or not. That's part of what she's saying. Yeah, Dave.
Maybe a couple examples. Like during the impeachment, when Clinton was impeached, it's like suddenly everybody became an expert in constitutional law. So everyone wasn't to talk about it. And the talk shows. To be knowledgeable about it and to be able to make judgments about it and so forth.
Yeah, the talk shows are good places for Gereda. Everybody's got an opinion. It isn't an opinion that is not relevant to anything they know or anything they care that should be, that concerns them and so forth. And that's what I think, and that's what he calls uprooted. Whatever it is, we're trying to understand what it is to pass the word along, and when your conversation has become uprooted. Before anybody says no more for a minute. We need some quotes. We're drifting off into making up Heidegger instead of reading Heidegger, which is good fun, but we've got to go back to reading it. So let's see now. I'm on 212 still, looking at crucial quotes. So we're talking about understanding things only superficially and so forth. I didn't read that first paragraph yet, did I, on 212? Let's read it. In a language which is spoken when one expresses oneself, there lies an average intelligibility. Now, this is our problem, and what to do with that, and we're going to try to understand. And in accordance with this intelligibility, the discourse which is communicated can be understood to a considerable extent, even if the hearer doesn't bring himself into such a kind of being towards what the discourse is about as to have a primordial understanding of it. That's to have a primordial understanding of it. You've got to really be there in the presence of the phenomenon. We do not so much understand the entities that are talked about. We already are listening only to what is said in the talk as such. What is said in the talk gets understood, but what the talk is about is understood only proximally and superficially. That's the carburetor example, perfectly. Now, that's one kind of Gereda, but that's not gossip. That's just you have to talk about stuff that you don't have direct knowledge of. He says we have the same thing in view because it is in the same averageness, so we have a common understanding. And that's fine. And now, I'm looking at my quotes, and now comes passing the word along and gossiping. So let's go down a little further. And skipping to the middle of the page, middle of the paragraph, middle of everything, a sentence. And because this discoursing has lost its primary relationship of being toward the entity talked about, or else never achieved such a relationship, it does not communicate in such a way as to let the entity be appropriated in a primordial manner, but it communicates rather by following the route of gossiping and passing the word along. And then it goes in wider circles, and people understand it less and less. And there's no grounds anymore. People are just repeating it till it gets aggravated to complete groundlessness. And that's certainly negative. But just to say, and indeed the idle talk is not confined to vocal gossip that spreads, there's scribbling, which is now maybe blogging, where people are passing their opinions around. It doesn't have to be just talking to people. And then it's not based so much on hearsay as superficial reading. He says, I'm just trying to read stuff that will give us a clue. The average understanding will never be able to decide what has been drawn from primal sources with a struggle and how much is just gossip. That is, just words, talk, but nothing behind it. The average understanding will not want any such distinction, and does not need it because, of course, it understands everything. Well, that's okay for a while. Let me, because so. And now there's all this negative talk then on 213, and that's more of what, I guess I just have to read this because we've gotten so deep into trying to understand what's negative about it. The top of 213. The groundlessness of idle talk is no obstacle to its becoming public. Idle talk is the possibility of understanding everything without previously making the thing one's own. It's funny. More and more as I read it, I think it fits the carburetor's case, but it doesn't fit the case that I think is really interesting, which is the relevance test, whether what you're talking about is anything you or who you're talking to should care about. But so see if that ever comes up. If this were done, idle talk would flounder and so forth. Idle talk is something which anyone can rake up. It is not only releases one from the task of genuine understanding, but develops an undifferentiated kind of intelligibility for which nothing is closed off. Well, yeah, but that doesn't strike me as particularly, it's negative. I mean, it certainly isn't giving any positive contribution, but it doesn't seem to be right on for negative. So let's try once more. Discourse which belongs to the essential state of Dasein's being and has a share in constituting Dasein's disclosedness has the possibility of becoming idle talk. And when it does, it serves not so much to keep being in the world open for us in an articulated understanding as to close it off and cover up the entities within the world. To do this one need not aim to deceive. It's not lying. That's not the point. Idle talk does not have the kind of being which belongs to consciously passing off something. The fact that something has been said groundlessly and gets passed along in further retelling amounts to perverting the act of disclosing into an act of closing off. For what is said is always understood proximately as saying something, that is, an uncovering something. So by very nature, idle talk closes off, since to go back to the ground of what is talked about is something which it leaves undone. Well, what do you think? I mean, okay, go ahead.
I mean, the Aristotle example that he gave was a really clear example that I feel like has put what my conception on to. I think it was a mistake when he said that the negative aspect of the Greek's way of dealing with or saying heavy objects fall faster is that it was wrong. I mean, like that's just like that. I mean, why do you want to privilege your like special relativity conception of the way objects fall over?
Well, but this is, but so it's wrong. And it's being wrong is not what's important.
Right, exactly. So for the Greeks, when like Aristotle first said heavy objects fall faster, like it was an intuitive description of their world that really helped out, right? I think the negativity in this doesn't lie in the fact that like it has a tendency to cover up world. That tendency to cover up world comes from when we go in for something like access and want something to say. The negativity that Heidegger is trying to express here in something like what Aristotle was doing in his description is when the Greeks started repeating and understanding their world with the phrase heavy objects fall faster, they were no longer, like they didn't do it themselves.
No, wait, enough. I've heard enough about heavy objects. Whoever back there said we're not talking about scientific stuff was right. We're not. And it's neither, if it's a bad example, it's a bad example. No, I don't want to hear about it anymore. Go ahead. There isn't a relation between Das Man and idle talk. Yes. Is that what you're saying? Well, I can explain. Well, there isn't much of a relation. I'll try to explain as best I can see. They're similar, but not in an interesting way, really, because what's clear about Das Man is you can make a distinction between conforming, which everybody has to do in their pronunciation and everything, and being a conformist, doing what you do for the sake of the one, for looking good, for doing what's respectable, and so forth. That's a nice, clear distinction. I wish I could get the same grip here, because you can say clearly about Das Man that if people didn't conform, there wouldn't be any intelligibility, and conforming is a completely positive thing. And you can say, and on the other hand, if everybody only did what one did, there'd never be anything interesting or original or people taking responsibility or doing what's appropriate in their unique situation. And that would be bad news. And so you can clearly say conformism is conformity, that is, doing things the way, following the norms of the culture is good, and running your life by asking what are the norms and just doing them in your way of dealing with yourself and people and so forth, that's just bad. Now, I'm looking for something parallel to that, and you're right to want it, but I haven't seen it yet. I mean, I want to find a way in which idle talk is something that's really necessary and important, and we couldn't have intelligibility without it. Roughly, I think that's supposed to be. We have to talk about things that we haven't got a primordial understanding of. We've never actually seen them. We can't, and we have just been told secondhand about them from the newspapers and the radio and talk shows and so forth. No, I went too far. Talk shows are not part of it. They're bad. No, but you've got to talk about things that you haven't got firsthand experience of, because there's a lot in the world that you haven't, and that's important for intelligibility. It goes beyond the concrete context that you are in. But then comes, and I don't know another word for it, what's the bad thing? Well, the bad thing isn't very clear to me yet. It seems to be talking about, I really think there are three, but I was going to sum that up, but I better start. I mean, I think there's a neutral thing, which is talking about stuff that you don't have a first-hand experience of, but we need to talk about, like, well, what was wrong with the car? And there's a lot that we talk about that we don't have primordial understanding of, but our conversation and our ability to organize and to coordinate our activities would break down without it. Maybe that's the crucial thing. That's the neutral kind of talk. I don't want to call it idle talk. And then there's really idle talk, which I think isn't just talking about what you don't really know about primordially, because you've got to do that. It's talking about what you don't know about primordially and is none of your business. Then you really got into a negative sort of thing that has no use in the way people live and coordinate their activity, and just gives them the opportunity to pretend to know things and just to gossip, period. So I think I think we're getting there to a positive, neutral, and negative story. Yeah, Melissa. Wait, talk loud if you can. Okay, I guess that's, I'll repeat it because you couldn't hear it. Frankfurt says that when you're bullshitting, you're trying to say things that impress some person with how much you know, or how much understanding you have of something in which you don't really have any understanding of it all, and you're not really even trying to convey an understanding, and it doesn't matter to you whether it's true or false. You're just trying to, if it's just trying to impress people, then it's not like Heidegger's view, I think. I think you could add to Frankfurt, you just want to keep the conversation going, or is that not bullshit yet? That's just friendliness or something, talkativeness. Yeah. Yeah. I think you have to add that to the negative list. I mean, what I don't understand yet, and I don't want to spend, I can't spend much more time on it. What I would like to have, and you can come and think about it maybe and come and talk to me in office hours, is I can think of the positive side is pretty clear. You've got to talk about stuff that you don't have a primordial understanding of to coordinate your activity and make a shared intelligibility. And I can think of, is that the neutral one or the positive one? That's the positive one. What was the neutral one? Have I squished the two together? I guess maybe the positive one is what I got it. I just squished the two together. Positive would be when you talked about the situation that you were in and you had primordial understanding and you were pointing it out. That would be just plain Reda. Then there would be this kind of neutral talk where for coordinating things and conveying some information. You talk about stuff you don't really know much about. And then comes the one I haven't got a clear grip in, this idle talk. Is it gossip? That means talking about what's none of your business? Or is it bullshit, meaning showing off by making all kinds of complicated, snowing people with complicated talk, which you don't really have any understanding of and you don't care, and it isn't a question of true or false, but just looking good? That could be another kind of it. Another kind is when you are talking about... no, maybe that's enough for the negative kind. Wait, there's somebody before you. Yes, you. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I meant the guy behind you with fun. You and then him. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so when I engage in idle talk, it's generally to avoid awkwardness. And it's generally because that's how one should act in that situation. In some respect, isn't idle talk the same as how far you're supposed to stand from someone?
Well, good. That's why you have to keep, there's another thing of just making conversation. And surely I can't believe, I'm not sure, but maybe Heidegger and Kierkegaard aren't against if you're, sitting next to somebody at a dinner making conversation about things. But that's not gossip. I think that it's okay. I would call that the neutral thing, where you are talking, you're not covering stuff up, you're not showing off, you're talking about what's none of your business, and you're not pretending that you know something you don't know. The neutral thing is you're using language to be sociable, to get some shared activity done or some kind of coordinated activity. That sounds okay. But now I want to hear from you. Yeah. That's right. Okay. Heidegger.
In other words, you know these things about this person, but you're not going to talk about those, but you don't want to have it silent because he says that there can't be a meaningful silence unless you actually have something meaningful to say.
That's right. Maybe there's something I sort of sympathize here. What you're saying now maybe is that they don't like small talk. They don't like talk just for the sake of filling the vacuum. They'd rather you either keep silent or you talk about what's important to you and the other person. I think that makes sense.
One other thing, though, is that she mentioned something that really is kind of an absent in this conversation, which is that communication through talk, only a portion of the communication is in the sentence. So not only might you be trying to impress, but you might be sending all kinds of messages. And idle talk can be just a way of asserting community, of asserting membership in communities that would be otherwise maybe damaged by silence. You see someone who's your neighbor, and you want positively maintain your sense of community.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm afraid I think that's sort of off the chart, only in the sense that Heidegger just doesn't think about it. I don't think he would call that Gereda. Because I don't think it's sort of that doesn't have the effect of covering anything up, or it's got a kind of community effect. Boy, those are weird things. I didn't think there was so much in this. Okay, you get the last word because time is up.
At the top of page 13, Heidegger says, the groundlessness of idle talk is no obstacle to its becoming public. Instead, it encourages this idle talk as the possibility of understanding everything without previously making the thing its own. Which seems like he's kind of saying idle talk is what creates this public understanding of everything without really authentically grasping it.
Well, it sounds like bluffing. It sounds like close to bullshit, where you use idle talk to be able to seem to understand everything, but not really.
And then at the bottom of the page, he says, the one prescribes one's state of mind and determines what and how one sees. So it almost, like if he goes through it on page 13, it's almost like he's saying idle talk is one of the ways, or is one of the important ways in which the one gets, made and everyone knows about it. It's like idle talk is everything to just everyone superficially.
Okay, we have to stop. If you feel like telling me more, please come to office hours and tell me about it, because I think now that we've gotten this far, it would be nice to get some crisp conclusion out of it.